Hi, everybody. Welcome to lecture 6 in our series on the Trivium. That is the first three of the classical liberal arts grammar, rhetoric, and logic. So far, we've talked about grammar and rhetoric. We've also introduced Aristotle's introduction of logic, how he understood what he called the logic of discovery and the three acts of mind. That is what we do when we practice logic. In this lecture, we're turning to the logic of terms. And we'll look at three different elements in Aristotle's logic. The first is terms, second is propositions, and the third is arguments themselves. So today we'll see what we can say about the formulation and interaction of terms within Aristotle's thinking. We're calling this lecture Working with Terms, Categories, Division, and Collection. What we're really going to be introduced to here is a picture of the world, a vision of the world that Aristotle held, that the things we see in reality are not simply words, right? Our language isn't in a kind of arbitrary relationship with reality. But as Aristotle's teacher put it, that reality can to some degree be cut at the joints. You'll forgive the image. My own grandfather, as it happens, was a butcher, and so he was adept at finding in animal bodies the joints, the ligaments, the bones, where something needs to be cut in order to preserve and then to a degree do honor to the animal that will be consumed. You don't want to waste the animal, right? You need to understand how the world is put together and where those joints are. In the same way, Aristotle is going to help us to do this with categories, and we'll start with that. And then he's going to talk about how to work with those categories to derive new knowledge, even here at the level of terms. So, we're talking about categories. The term category comes from the Greek word kategorein, which is a legal term for making an accusation. Making an accusation. So, if a person steals something, that person, if they engage in that pattern of conduct over a long period of time, might come to be called a thief or a robber. Something like this, right? That would be the result of a legal trial that found that person guilty of having committed those acts. Now, over time, of course, because we're not just talking about reality in this case, or nature in this case, we're talking about an individual human being. Maybe that person can change over time. Maybe that person can develop. They can say, well, I at this stage of life, I was a thief or a robber, but then over a period of time, I grew and I understood the wrongness of those actions, and now I am no longer, right? But in any case, how we categorize something means what we identify it as to be, right? And of course, there are lots of philosophical and even political questions that can arise out of this. For Aristotle, logical categories that he identifies are the most general or universal concepts, terms, and words that we use to describe things. He's trying to kind of go up to the top level, right? What are the most general ways that we can think about reality, right? Because in order to think about reality and not only to feel reality or to experience reality, but to think about it, right? And to understand it, we need categories, we need ideas, we need ways of splitting up reality that correspond to reality itself. This is Aristotle's understanding on my understanding. So, thanks to the producer of this Google image, Aristotle, we have his Greek terms here on the left, identifies 10 categories. 10 categories. We're going to look briefly at four of them: substance, quantity, quality, and relation. But they include six others: place, date, posture, state, action, and passion. And we have some examples of them here listed on the right. The idea here is that all of reality, insofar as reality can be thought about, uh, fits into one of these 10 categories. Now, the case of individual people is distinct from this, right? Because we are all perfectly familiar with the political convictions of our time, which are beautiful. Don't categorize people. Don't reduce a person to some category. Don't put a person in a box. Yes, I say, and Aristotle also would say yes, right? But if you want to understand reality, and if you want to understand things about people who are free with dignity and deserving of respect, you need to be able to utilize these categories. Such is Aristotle's view. In his view, and here we'll rely on some text from Hauser, Aristotle's theory of the 10 general categories in sum is this. Every specific term we use to describe any individual thing in the universe, like man, horse, grammatical, or cutting, or being cut, ultimately, every specific term will fall under one or another of the 10 most general categories, such as substance or quality or action or passion. Whenever we see something, we're able to identify, okay, that's an action, right? Or that's a substance, or that's a relation, or something like this. And that helps us to see how reality is composed, and then over time to move toward a better and better understanding of how reality is composed, right? So, looking at the four that are most significant of Aristotle's categories, this is certainly the one that is most kind of fraught in our time and has been maybe most historically interesting. Substance. This describes what a thing is in its core or fundamental nature, right? You might say about a person, well, she's a person of real substance. And what would that mean? That she within herself, has integrity or has knowledge or has enormous ability, or she's not just simply, using words to make people feel excited or create distractions or something. But if you have a substantial case, right, or I substantiate a case, it means there's something there, right? And there's a there, if you want to quote Gertrude Stein. Individual substances are the independently existing things in the world, and they're contrasted here on the slide with accidents. So substance and accident, right? So I myself, speaking to you here, would be a substance, right? I have a certain history. I have persisted in this subjective identity that I have over time. I can be changed. I can be placed differently. I can have different qualities, different hairstyles, glasses, clothing, jobs, identities, whatever the case may be. But there's still, in some sense, Pache David Hume, a me here. There's some kind of self across time. Most of Aristotle's examples of substance come from the natural world. So, like an oak tree, for example, right? So you have an acorn and an oak tree. They are substantially the same. It's the same plant, but you wouldn't look at an acorn and an oak tree and without knowledge of biology immediately think, oh, those are the same things. So you can't see substance in the way that we observe that something is 6 feet tall, or for example, but it is a logical term designating whatever makes that thing what it is most essentially. The other categories are a little less philosophically fraught. Quantity answers the question of how much of the thing is there, right? So that can either be what we called, and we had this back in the discussion of the liberal arts, discrete quantity, like how many apples are there? There are 4 apples, right? Or continuous quantity. How much does that apple weigh? It weighs 0.42 pounds or something like that. So in one case, there are things we can count, and in the other, there are things we can't count. And both of these would be attributes of a thing that pertain to its quantity. Quality of a thing answers the question, what is the thing like, or what kind of thing is it? This can be something that we perceive with any one of our 5 senses. So the color of a thing, the sound, its taste, odors, textures. The overall shape of a thing might be sensed with all of our senses. That pertains to the quality of a thing. Also, the habits of a body gotten through development. So, I mean, I speak the English language, right? So that's one of my qualities. I am a speaker of English. It's almost a property of myself. And I just acquired that over time. It didn't come with, my genetic inheritance or anything like that. Um, and then the powers or capacities of a body. What abilities do I have? Hauser uses the term innermost here. So all of these things could be called qualities of a thing, of a substance. And then finally, we have relation. And relation is the broadest category, but on the slide here, we have listed the other 6 as well, because all 6 of these remaining categories are themselves kinds of relation, right? So when did something happen? That's a temporal relation. This thing, this substance occurred at this time or did this at this time. Where something occurred, same thing, place it in space. The posture of a thing. How are all the parts of the body related to one another? The equipment of a thing. How something is interacting with its immediate environment. How is it kind of outfitted for whatever it is doing? And then action and a passion. An action is when I do something. A passion is when something is done to me. So fun fact, when we say I am passionate about X, whatever X may be, it's really saying that I am so in love with, committed to, compelled by X that it's as if it has control over me. Like, oh, I can't help myself, right? I have to study this thing, or I have to pursue this career, or I have to, advocate for this cause, whatever the case may be. I'm passionate about it. Interesting. Okay, so we're back with our 10 categories here. So again, what Aristotle is trying to do is, we're at the very beginning of logic here. We're talking about cutting reality, again, with apologies for the image, cutting reality at the joints. How is reality composed? Right? And these 10 categories for Aristotle express that. Okay, so I've got some kind of picture of what's out there, and I've started formulating my concepts. So like the cat is on the mat, maybe something like that. I have a concept of cat, I have a concept of mat, there's a relation of location, each one has its own properties. Nice. But now, even before I move on to making judgments or arguments, I want to be able to draw some conclusions based on these terms just by thinking about the terms themselves. And that's where we talk about dividing and collecting terms. The division and collection of terms enables us to see how one term is different from terms that fall under some one of these other 9 categories. So how does it relate to other terms? And also how a term is related to other terms within that category under which it falls. So we're considering the logical relationships among these terms that we have been formulating. And this is our first active step in logic, properly speaking, right? So we're working with the terms now. Every term that we formulate, every concept we form about something in the world has 2 features. Its extension and its comprehension. So the extension of a term refers to how widely it extends, the range of things to which it applies, right? So apple, I see an apple and I say apple, right? I see a green apple, apple, I think, right? And then I see a pear, and it's not an apple. So I've reached the end of the extension of that term. And over time, I'm able to see, okay, there's 8 kinds of apples at the grocery store. Those are apples, but these are pears, right? So I have a sense of the extension of the term apple in that context. Comprehension is what a term means, right? And this is the basis for how we draw its limits or its extension. So I know that an apple is red or green and has a certain kind of shape, right? We don't have to get into the biology of it, although you certainly could. I mean, genetically speaking, you could specify this quite precisely. But I know what I'm looking for when I look for an apple. And when I see a banana or a pear or an orange, I know that's not it, right? Because I know what an apple is. I know the meaning of an apple. And that understanding of the meaning, that comprehension of the term apple that I know, enables me to accurately define the extension of the term apple, to say this is an apple, that is not an apple. We learn comprehension, the meaning of a term, by finding a term's logical inferiors and logical superiors. And this is going to be the key concept here for the division and collection of terms. Now, when we say inferior and superior, these are terms that happily in our democratic society we are not very happy to use all the time. I mean, certainly one doesn't want to say that one is superior to others in a general sense. In this case, we're not talking certainly about value or even about ability. We're talking about a degree of generality. Degree of generality. So thing is a pretty logically superior term because you could use the term thing for almost any thing, right, in English. But, I don't know, the blue bird sitting on the branch this morning is a really logically inferior term. It's very specific, right? And you can build up from that to ultimately something like thing, or as Aristotle would prefer, being, right? But it doesn't mean that the concept of thing or being is better than or more valuable than the bird sitting on the branch this morning. It just means that it is more general. The goal of using division and collection of terms, which we're going to see some examples of in a moment, is to find a good definition of a term, right? Because we need to comprehend the term, the thing that we're looking at, and then we need to define its extension. This is how we can get our bearings in reality, in the world. We look for a good definition of a term. So we use division and collection to arrange the fundamental or essential features of a term in order, going from the narrower or more specific features to the wider or more general features until we arrive at the category of substance, of what the thing is, right? So, even in the case of an apple that we saw, I mean, there might be some very narrow and specific features, like, this apple has a bump on it or something. This apple has a bruise. That's a very particular, almost individual quality of that apple. But once we move up and up and up, we're able to figure out, okay, what makes an apple an apple? Like, yeah, it's either red or green and kind of shaped like that, but how can I define that in a more precise way? That leads us ultimately to a scientific definition of an apple, and even looking at the genetics of apples. Here's an image of a good division and collection of terms. In this case, let's start at the bottom with Socrates and Plato, because we've talked a lot about them. So I meet Socrates. Hi, Socrates. Nice to meet you. I want to understand where you fit in the order of things in the world, right? Okay, well, Socrates and Plato are both individual instances of the concept man, or the thing, the substance, man, right? Great. So, and man here means human beings. So we might distinguish between human beings, which are defined by Aristotle famously as a rational animal, and irrational animals, animals that are like us, mortal bodies, but do not use reason in the same way that we do. Okay, so we see that the larger category here is animal. And then just staying on the left side, what is the larger category of animal? Well, a living body. An animal is a living thing. What's the category above a living body? Well, a body at all, right? A thing in the world. What about above that? Well, a substance, right? Not only am I a body, but I have a particular I am a particular kind of body. I have a substantial identity, and we end up ultimately with being itself, or with the thingness of that thing. So again, this tree is showing us. You could start from the top as well. So I'm thinking of it's like a quiz show, right? I'm thinking of something in my mind. Well, is it a body or a spirit? Let's start at that level. Oh, it's a body, right? Oh, okay. Is it alive or dead? Oh, it's alive. Oh, okay. Right. So we keep moving on. Is it an animal, plant? You could say animal, plant, mineral, whatever, right? You divide each of the terms, and by moving through that, you can move from a broad thing like guess what I'm thinking about, all the way down to guessing correctly what that person has in mind. Now, when we're dividing terms like that, so we saw, for example, living thing was divided into animal and plant, right? We want to, and here we're drawing on Thomas Aquinas, who kind of adapted Aristotle's thinking. He identified, Thomas Aquinas, three ways that a thing can be composed of parts. Right? So on the one hand, we have integral parts. So some parts of a thing need to be there in order for the thing to be that thing. Like without those parts, it wouldn't be that thing. An example might be the roof and walls of a house, right? If I have a kind of structure with only walls but no roof, I would have trouble identifying that as a house, and certainly not a house that I would want to live in. It doesn't really provide shelter, right? Or if I go to the park and there's a roof that's just held up by pillars on the side, maybe that's a nice patio or a nice kind of veranda, but I wouldn't call it a house because, again, it's not going to provide shelter. So logically speaking, the roof and the walls are integral to the house. You can't have a house unless it has a roof and walls. Subjective parts. This is in the sense of individual instances of a larger whole. So parts of the category animal, right, or that classification would include, for example, birds and lions. Birds and lions are subjective parts of the larger category animal. Right? Animal is made up of all of these different subjective parts, of which birds and lions are two. And finally, potential parts. So these refer to the abilities or capacities of a thing that may or may not be exercised. So my sight, my hearing, these are parts of me. My ability to speak. I'm speaking with you right now. That is a part of me, right? But what kind of part is it? If I lost my ability to speak, I would still be me. My life would change significantly, but I would still be myself. Good. So if we're dividing things in this way, Hauser provides for us four rules. And so as you're again playing that kind of quiz show game, is it an animal or a plant? Is it living or dead, and so forth? You can ask, is it a real division? So is each part narrower than the whole? So if you say I'm thinking of a boat, and you say is it a I don't know, is it a car or a plane? You'd say, well, that doesn't make any sense, right? I need to know, is it a red boat or a blue boat? I need to have something that's more narrow than what I started with. A good division should be exhaustive, right? Because if I say, is it an animal or a plant, but it's actually like a mineral, okay, well now I'm in trouble because I've left something out and I'm not going to be able to move forward. Because I could say, no, it's not an animal or a plant. Well, I'm left empty-handed. A good division must be exclusive. The parts of it cannot overlap, because if they do overlap, then I can't, again, move forward in my little quiz show and move on knowing and having confidence that I've kind of exhaustively covered the stage that came before. And finally, the parts of each division must fall into the same category. So if I'm talking about boats and then I start talking about fruit instead, it doesn't make sense and it doesn't advance my inquiry. I want to give just one example in our last maybe 3 minutes here. If you're taking the class that accompanies the series, you'll have an opportunity to work with this text by James Madison, Federalist number 10. This text is famous justly for many reasons. It was one of 85 articles and essays written in this case by James Madison, but the Federalist Papers, of which it's a part, were composed by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay in the years indicated there, 1787 to 8. They're written in plain language, and it was Hamilton who kind of initiated the thing, right? So Hamilton wrote most of those essays, but Madison wrote a good portion as well. These Federalist Papers were instrumental in seeing through the passage of the U.S. Constitution after the Articles of Confederation. This paper by Madison is a great example of the division of terms, which is why we're looking at it. Um, it's focused on factions, defined as groups of citizens with interests that differ from the interest of the nation as a whole. So we call these today like interest groups, right? It's possible to have a majority faction or a minority faction. You could have 90% of the country that hates 10%. Right? In that case, that 90% is concerned with only its own good to the exclusion of that 10%. You could also have it go the other way around. Maybe you have the 1% that doesn't care about the 99. I've heard that mentioned. Madison is concerned that the rights of minorities to protect those against what he calls or what would be called by others, the tyranny of the majority. He's worried that in a federal government or in a country like the United States at all, minority groups would be kind of silenced, and the majority will would carry the day in all cases. So he's making the argument here that representative democracy, such as is outlined in the US Constitution, is actually better able to prevent factions. It's better able to control the tyranny of the majority so that minority interests will be duly represented at the federal level. Now, spoiler, we're going to, if we are taking this class together, we'll be able to look at this together a bit more. But here is a very helpful chart outlining the way that Madison develops his argument, right? So he begins with the question, how are the mischiefs of faction to be cured? Okay, well, one logically speaking, again, there are two options, right? If I want to get rid of anything, in this case, the mischiefs of faction, well, I got to either remove the causes of that thing so it never arises in the first place, or I've got to remove the effects. So even if it does arise, it won't cause problems. Now, that's a good division because it is exhaustive. Those are clearly exclusive kind of possibilities. And they cover the board. Like you got to pick between one of these two. Okay, well, let's start with removing causes, right? So let's say I decide I'm going to eliminate, violent factions in the country just by saying that, you can't have any opinions. I'm going to destroy liberty. Or I can give everybody the same opinion. This is the second division. These are two exhaustive options for preventing factions from arising in the first place. If everybody thinks the same thing, or if nobody's allowed to think whatever they want. And he concludes that this would be worse than the cure, or worse, a cure that's worse than the problem itself, and leaves aside this option of removing the causes. And then secondly, in removing the effects, just move briskly through this. Well, he says, okay, well, it's either going to be a minority faction or a majority faction. If it's a minority, then it's not going to threaten the country. But if it's a majority, then it could. So let's look at majority. Okay, so it's a majority faction. It's either going to prevent the same interests and passions. You can prevent that either by preventing the same interests and passions from arising in that majority, or by rendering the majority unable to carry its schemes into effect. Those are two ways of dealing with majority factions. And okay, if you can prevent the same interests and passions from arising in a majority, that's good. You don't have a dangerous faction. But if you can't prevent that, then you have to render the majority unable to carry schemes into effect. And so then we have a final division here between two ways of doing that, either a pure democracy or a republic. So all of this to say, this is not a course on political philosophy. There are such courses. I teach them. They might be represented on this channel at some point. But the point is that he builds his argument entirely by the division and collection of terms. So this is a great example of how this can be used, even without yet building an argument. I mean, he does that under on the Republic here at the bottom, giving reasons for his view. But this is a great way to lay out a case just by the division and collection of terms. Thank you very much, friends. Next time we continue with the logic of terms.